I'm Dr. Erin Stair. Please just call me Erin, and I'm the host of the Trial Site News podcast. Super excited to chat with you today. For our viewers and listeners, we have Dr. Sabine Hazan, who's here. She does lots of cool stuff. So I'm just going to let you go ahead and introduce yourself, what you're working on, what you do.
Gastroenterologist by trade. I I went into medicine to understand life, and life took me on a path of going into GI. GI wasn't as fulfilling for me as I thought it would be because it didn't really answer questions of life and death. And so I went more into the research path and research, putting products to market for pharmaceutical companies, or trying to anyways, if the trial was good or the medication was good. When C. diff was the bacteria that I was always involved with for enrolling for clinical trials. When the trials didn't work, I would do fecal transplant. And when fecal transplant showed me a little bit more than curing C. diff. And I say curing because 92 to 99% success on curing C. diff and not seeing the patients back in your office is a cure, in my opinion. So when C. diff was improved and cured with fecal transplant, the process of taking stools from a healthy donor and putting it into an unhealthy, and when that started happening I started seeing changes in arthritis in some patients. I started seeing one of my patients with Alzheimer's had remembered his daughter's date of birth. And so when that happened, I went on the path of curiosity, asking the questions. Well, what is doing that, right? What microbes are playing the role of regaining the memory of a patient, and what microbe are suppressing the memory, right? Because that's how I kind of look at it. And then little by little, data from my colleagues, which I call the Biome Squad, doctors that do clinical trials on the front line, started seeing things like, chronic urinary tract infections improving, psoriasis in one patient. I remember one of my doctors, and then a doctor in China actually said to me, ulcerative colitis, he had some amazing success. Or a patient with suicidal ideation, he transplanted stools of a healthy donor, and then the patient was happy again. So that curiosity in me pushed me to try to understand the microbiome. And I started sending my stools to different labs, and I realized none of those labs were validated, because the same stool, I would get different results. In other words, a different fingerprint of the microbiome. And so that's when I joined up with Dr. Sidney Feingold, who wrote the book on anaerobic bacteria. And, fell for the man, as a genius that he was, to write a book to educate us on the power of anaerobic bacteria that create infections. And so he guided me onto opening this lab and hiring the right person. And I just jumped. And then jumping into this abyss of looking at the microbiome brought multiple geniuses that I'm so grateful to work with, from Dr. Tom Barodi to Dr. Sheldon Jordan at UCLA, to Sasha Bistritsky at UCLA, psychiatrist, and to Dr. Wise, who's a rheumatologist at USC. So all these doctors, and then also doctors that my colleagues, Neil Stolman from San Francisco, Paul Fierstadt from Yale, Colleen Kelly from Brown University, Alex Karutz from University of Minnesota. So it's all these geniuses that basically just kind of came with the same thirst for knowledge of wanting to know, right? We all go into medicine for being detectives, right? We don't go into medicine because we want to, some of us anyways, I'm sure some of people have made a business out of it, but those of us that went into medicine for the quest for knowledge, this is, the holy grail, right? This is looking into the abyss and finding a whole new world. And then understanding that those bugs is what really helps you fight an infection like COVID, or those bugs help you fight an autoimmune process that you've been having, or depression or anxiety. and really fine tuning on which bugs are doing that. And that's really my goal. My goal is, and I remember speaking at a meeting where the head of the National Institute of Standards, Scott Jackson, was at that meeting, and they invited me to speak. And he said, basically, we just need to create a dictionary. So I said to him, I said, well, why don't you create it? And he said, oh, no, the government does not have the ability to do that. So I said, okay, well, I guess I'm going to create it, and give him credit for creating it, because really it was his idea to start, a dictionary of bugs and disease. And that's what I'm all about.
No, I think it's cool. I think I was going through some of your sites to just kind of like prep for this interview, and it's really cool. It's really fascinating. I mean, the microbiome, it's just like this whole other world, and yeah, it's fascinating. The word progenobiome, am I saying that right?
Yes.
So can you explain what that means? And that's like one.
So I always believe that the microbiome is linked to your genes. So in other words, you're born with genetic material, but you're also born with microbes that you inherit from family members, generations and generations down. And I say that because when I looked at my microbiome, I was one of the first patients. I was actually the first guinea pig. I call myself a guinea pig because I am. All scientists, we try things on us first before we try it on patients. So I basically took a stool sample and analyzed the microbiome and realized there's microbes that are probably from my great-great-grandmother in my gut. And so, because some of them are just not from this area. They're from Spain, North Africa. So, so what happened is I started looking at that, and I said, wow, so I inherit my genes from my parents, but I probably also inherit my microbes. So progenobiome is from your progeny to your genes to your microbes to your biome. And so that's why I named it progenobiome. But it's a mouthful. And, I have to give credit to my brother because he was the one that created it in a way and kind of put it.
No, I think it's great, and your explanation, it's awesome. I think it's kind of cool to think about it that way too. You're getting all these bacteria from generations past. Like, that's cool.
Ability with a stool specimen to look at bacteria, but also genetics, because we have in our stools
a new kind of family tree. So the word reflorization, you're credited with coming up with that word. Is that right?
Yes, I was tired of fecal transplant, and
it doesn't sound. This is marketing, right? Like fecal.
I was given this role essentially with, I think God gave me this role of stirring up, the microbiome in a way, and he knew that I was kind of a hurricane, and so when this came on, I felt like, what, how do we explain it to people? And really, we have to retransform our looking of stools, right? We have been taught, and rightfully so, because, it's almost the waste of humanity should not be touched, right? In a way, because that's why it's a waste. It goes back to the ground, right? So it is a gift to be able to analyze it, but also understanding that it should not be, manipulated so much, because we have to understand that it all goes back to the planet. And to me, we come from dirt and we go back to dirt, right? The process of dying, and I say this, is microbes in the gut, and the process of a body decomposing is really those microbes in the gut that decompose the body and put you back into the earth. So in essence, you're coming from microbes that are like generations and generations from your family, but then those microbes take over and you go back to the earth. I think one of the most amazing study that I want to do and that I want to research is actually following the process of decomposition of the body and testing the microbes in the gut and then the microbes in the soil. And I'm hoping somebody's going to latch on and want to support this research with me. But that's my interest, right? To understand what happens to these microbes once we die? Do they come back to the earth, and what happens to them? Because, look at a bacteria like C. diff, right? Which is in our guts. Some people think it's because we colonized. I tend to believe that we were born with C. diff as a non-toxigenic C. diff. And when C. diff gets suppressed, when the Clostridium families and the diversity gets killed, C. diff starts secreting its toxin to kill the host. But C. diff was there to begin with. It was just a happy little bacteria wanting to do nothing until we gave it antibiotics, more bacteria, more antibiotics. Because what are antibiotics? They're, fungus, they're microbes, right? And we gave it back into the gut to kill off the diversity, which then makes the bacteria flourish and secrete a toxin. The main thing and the main lesson I learned from C. diff is that, it's an old bug. It's 10 million years old. They found it, that it's around for 10 million years old. So why would a 10 million year old bug all of a sudden want to kill us unless we trigger it to want to kill us, unless we disrupt it, right? So, and I like to think of the microbiome kind of, this little universe, mini universe of when you kill diversity, the ones that are like left will kill the host, because the whole point of the body is to stay in balance, so the microbes stay in balance. Once you disturb that balance, your bad microbes come up, your good microbes go down, viruses penetrate, and then you're susceptible to disease, to infections, to autoimmune processes, etc. And really, that's the path that I'm going to be demonstrating. There's a lot to write. We have about 25 papers in the process right now because we've discovered a lot.
I wanted to ask you, so, the fecal transplant or reflorization, sorry, that's
flora to flora, yes.
Okay, so that's one way to alter somebody's microbiome. So, and also my understanding is that you can do it through diet. Maybe there are other ways. So could you touch on that? Like, can you alter it significantly enough, in your opinion, to reduce a disease process, make someone feel better?
So certainly we've seen those patients who say, I went vegan and then I'm so much better. Or I went on a carnivore diet and I'm so much better, and it's both sides, right? So they're both, fighting. So you go, well, what is it, right? And nobody's really looked at, well, what does diet do? Is vegan better than carnivore? Is vegetarian better than vegan? So nobody has really looked at all that. Even cumin, for example. Is cumin good? Is cumin good for Mediterranean people, but maybe not so good in the Indian population? Remember, we're all from different sides of the world. So therefore, we are born to a family that was living in a certain part of the world. That part of the world had their own mixtures of microbes, right? When you go to Mexico and you're eating in a restaurant and all of a sudden you come back home and you're sick, it's because you're not used to their microbiome, to their microbes. And therefore you come back here and it was too much for your system because you went up in the, whatever microbe you got over there. But for that population survives. I remember being in Venezuela one time and I ate in a restaurant in the top of a mountain. And I got so sick coming back, and I realized that the people were washing the tomatoes in a pond where the ducks were pooping, right? So of course I got whatever came from the feces of the ducks, right? But for those people that live in that area, they're immune to that because that's what they were born with. That's what they were raised with. So to me, I think that's the interesting thing. And I think we're not doing enough research on things like that. What does vitamin C do to the gut microbiome? We're coming out with that data. What does vitamin D? We're coming out with that data. Awesome. So I think, there's a lot of to be said about, yes, the nutrients. I myself, would not want to, just because the procedure is disgusting, I would not want to be playing with stools the rest of my life to help patients. I would like physicians to fine tune the bugs and readjust the bugs, and therefore just transplant. And Dr. Alex Carruth says it best. He says it is the microbiome that we're transplanting, not feces. That's why it should not be called fecal transplant, but it should be called microbiota transplant or refloralization, because ultimately microbes we're playing with.
This made me think too of the hygiene hypothesis a little bit. Like
Yes.
you're like, they talk about like kids who grew up in farms. I grew up in like a farming area, and they talk, and my dad was a veterinarian. So I've always like kind of, I've been, I've been exposed to so many different things. But do you believe, and I remember talking to some physician, and I feel really badly because I can't remember his name right now, but there was this whole thing on the hygiene hypothesis and the microbiome. What are your thoughts on that?
Probably Martin Blazer you talked to, the missing microbes, maybe from New York, NYU, maybe. Anyways, what are my thoughts? Yes, absolutely. I just came back from speaking at a farm. I was at Polyface Farm. They believe in regenerative farming. And I was in a tent with 400 people that were not wearing masks, that don't even believe COVID exists, because they're so strong in their immunity. They're all farmers. They're all, in with the land, in with the group. And, none of them, I talked to them. I'm like, what do you mean? We didn't catch COVID? COVID didn't come? They're like, no, what are you talking about? We didn't catch COVID. They got hurt because of the businesses closing. And that's what affected them more than anything. So, so you learn from that, right? You learn that maybe we should go back to basics. Maybe we should let the kids play in the playground. You saw the studies of kids in kindergarten that were playing with the soil and planting, and they had less ear infections than kids in a classroom. What did we do what are we doing more and more? We're sterilizing. Why? Because those who are in control have an obsessive compulsiveness that they think that cleanliness equates putting Clorox on your counter and cleaning off all the microbes. What they're doing is they're sterilizing their environment, and therefore they're creating a dysbiosis in their gut because they're sterilizing their guts. Now you can live with a sterile gut, 100%. But the problem is when that sterile gut goes to India, it no longer is in a sterile environment, and you're getting predisposed to getting infections, viruses, etc. And so it's no surprise when you hear of people that die, that, especially in the wealthy population, they live in this ultra clean environment. And then all of a sudden they go to India and they start walking barefoot. And then parasites start coming in, and viruses and bugs. And then you end up hearing, well, they're dead of a cancer, or they're dead of, of Alzheimer's or something, right? So because it's one thing leads to another. I always say action leads to a reaction. You start with something and then it gets to something else, right? We started with C. diff, for example, and we gave antibiotics for that strep pneumonia that the person got. And it was fine, but we forgot to replenish the microbes that were killed. And that was the whole movement from Dr. Quigley of probiotics, right? The father of probiotics in GI. So I think this is important for us to understand, for us to know how to treat in the future, that it's not a one pill solution. It's not a one formula. It's really an art. It's multiple colors. And I think, that was the beautiful thing with Dr. Barodi, is he thinks like that. He treats Crohn's disease not with one pill, 2, 3, 4. When we started thinking of treating COVID, he said it needs multiple things. And I came up and said, well, it also needs vitamins. We need to put vitamin C, D, and zinc in it. And so that was the purpose, right? The purpose was to bring all that. And, I always say you can ask 100 people to paint a tree and they'll all paint it differently. Same thing with doctors, right? And that's okay, because that's what's beautiful. Asking questions, painting it differently. But you don't paint a tree with black and white color, black and white. You paint it with multiple colors, multiple shades of colors. That's what medicine should be. To practice the art of medicine, you need to start thinking of different ways. And it's not only in the medicines, it's also in the meditation. It's also in the exercise, into this, psychology. Obviously, if you've had an action where you lost a child, that's going to play an impact in your gut. And then that's going to start the chain reaction towards disease. But you have to understand what happened to begin with. So, it's very delicate, the whole thing. And I think we have to realize that it's not here, take a pill and you're going to be better. It's not.
I love what you said. I mean, I think that's a great description, like the art of medicine.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's a creative approach, and it's observing, being able to be aware and seeing, and that's amazing. You mentioned COVID, and I figured let's just talk a little bit about that since that's what everybody's talking about. But you and your team, you identified, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, you identified COVID-19, the genetic sequence in stool samples. You guys were the first, maybe the only, to do that. And I think you found there was like 30 mutations, or it was something like that. So yes, maybe like talk a little bit about that. And then what does that mean? What I was thinking, like, what does that mean for transmission? Like, do we have a fecal oral route now possibility, or not so much?
Yeah, so we don't know, right? But it certainly brings up the questions of, if I carry it in my stools and I go to a bathroom and somebody uses the bathroom after, and it's airborne now, because that's how viruses escape the fecal material. Can you transmit it? And is it enough of a transmitting? So we don't know. So that's question number one. Number two, why I wanted to look into COVID in the stools, because I realized early on that eventually everything ends up in the stools, right? My look and my work on the microbiome has shown me that every bug, from strep pneumonia is in your gut, right? It should belong up here, but it's in your gut. So there's a genetic imprint in your gut of every bug that you've ever encountered for every different areas of your body. And so to me, I felt, and also we knew that was the first hint. We knew that the virus latched on ACE2 receptors, right? And so when I saw that, I said, where's the biggest organ that has ACE2 receptors? I mean, yes, the blood, but also the bowels. And so therefore it dawned on me, and I obsessed about it. And I told my scientist, we all have our obsessions. And I told my scientist, I have to look at the gut. We have to look at the stools. And so he said, you're not going to find it. And finally, we kept harping on it. And then he called me and he goes, you won't believe this, but in 100% of the patients that were positive from throat swab, we found it. But also we found it in one guy who was never tested and was actually an asymptomatic carrier. And he had a different virus than the other people, right? So that's how I knew this was a different strain that he had, but he was asymptomatic. But in retrospect, when you ask the question, he had been sick months prior, never really knew that it was COVID. So here it is lingering in his gut. Now, at the same thing, a young girl who was 21 years old, I looked in her gut, and she was the daughter of a pediatrician friend of mine who was my first patient during the COVID time. And I analyzed her stools, and she was sick for 45 days. She had COVID in her stools for 45 days. And that was, again, something that said to me, wait a minute. So obviously it's in the gut for longer than we think. Maybe that's why we're not getting rid of it, right? Maybe because we're not focusing on the gut. We're all doing these throat swabs. We're all doing these nasal swabs, but we're not looking at the gut. So that was one. Now, the problem with gut microbiome is that you don't know if the virus is live or dead because it's a fingerprint, right? But you have to look at it as relative abundance, right? So in other words, how much of that virus is in the gut, right? So if you find one copy of the virus, well, it's not really significant, right? Okay, well, probably dead virus that's coming out. But if you find 5,000, 6,000, 10,000 copies of this virus, it's basically like a microscope zoning in and seeing a parasite that you didn't even know existed, right? And so that's what we saw. So when we started seeing that we had the potential and the possibility to identify COVID in the stools, we decided to say, well, let me do clinical trials to see if COVID disappears after I give it medication. So the before and after is more important to me than why is it working. In other words, why is vitamin C working on COVID? Why is vitamin D potentially working on COVID? Why is, hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, Eliquis, why are all these thought to be early treatment working on COVID? And is it in the gut, and then does it disappear from the gut? And so that's essentially our research to look at the microbiome. The other thing that I realized is, and knowing this from C. diff, obviously, if you have a dysbiosis, an imbalance in the gut, C. diff is going to secrete its toxin. And how do we fix that? By giving it multiple microbes and microbiome transplant. But same thing with COVID. If COVID is occupying the whole bowel, it had to have killed a bunch of other microbes that were essential for, metabolism or vitamin B, absorption. So that's why, to me, it was important to not only find the virus, but also look at what is the virus doing on the microbiome. What is it killing the microbiome? So we're fortunate because we had a big database before of stool samples, and our lab is validated. So in other words, I test my stools today. I retest myself in a month, a year. In fact, I was again the guinea pig on this because I tried different methods of treatment, and I gave it to myself, and I wanted to see what is it doing to my microbiome. And that was the discovery. The discovery was having a validated lab that you can reproduce the data and showing that at month 1, month 3, a year from now, the signature of your microbiome doesn't change. And so when the signature doesn't change, you can see the relative abundance of the microbes that are important changing up or down. And that was really my path. That's what I did.
And from your website, you're still conducting trials with the microbiome and COVID. It looks like you're recruiting, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So as much as everybody thinks, oh, we're getting vaccinated and we're fine, we're not done. We're not over.
I wanted to ask you about, so the COVID-19 disaster plan.
Yes.
Okay.
What we need to do it?
What is that? Yeah.
Yeah. So the disaster plan. So what happens is I'm on Facebook with a lot of friends, and actually people will say, oh my God, she's always on Facebook, but this is my communication with my colleagues. So I'm friends with a lot of doctors. And I'm on groups with a lot of doctors. So this is the place where we when COVID hit, we took on the role of, okay, we're back in internship, working on the floors of Jackson Memorial Hospital, for example, that's where I trained, and taking care of HIV patients that are coming vomiting blood or unconscious, and we have to fix them. So how do you fix these people? You have to rely on your colleagues because they do something that you haven't done, right? I mean, that whole collegial approach is really what we did from the beginning. So what happened is I kind of sounded the alarm because I saw the virus change from China to Italy. It was a different genome. And right off the bat, I said, this virus is mutating fast, and we need to be aware of this because the mutation is what's going to be a problem. And it's going to be a problem, I think, for vaccination because, if it's mutating too fast, how do you control that? Do you keep vaccinating every 3 months? I don't know. So basically what happened is I sent the alarm on Facebook to all my friends and on Facebook. And I said, this thing is coming. We need to set it up. And then I took my writer in my office, who I write my manuscript with. She's, we're a great team together. And I said, we need to write a disaster plan for the doctors because they're going to need to know how to manage these patients and how to protect themselves. And so I wrote it, and then I sent it to all my colleagues, and then they were sending me emails. And then that was a great way to collaborate because in a way, we went from 1,000 physicians to now 14 or 20,000 physicians that we are all connected. So that was, and that was the beginning. That was the disaster plan, was the beginning with them. The second thing was creating that protocol with hydroxychloroquine, vitamin C, D, and zinc was there to protect them, right? So in other words, you're on the front line, you're worried about COVID, why don't you try this protocol and why don't I follow you? So we started recruiting on that. The problem is, unfortunately, research got tainted. Not tainted, but it wasn't as easy to do. It wasn't as easy to recruit because it went so political that I couldn't recruit. Normally, clinical trials like that, I would have finished in 2 months, literally. The fact that as soon as I posted on Facebook, I'm doing a clinical trial, and then 100 trolls go on it and start trashing me, you go, what's going on? Normally, or even you put an ad on Facebook, it doesn't circulate, or trolls go on there and start trashing the trial and criticizing and bullying. And to me, it was, I'm in research. I'm allowed to ask the questions, right? That's what research is all about. Science is all about asking the questions. Who is stopping me from asking the questions? If we stop ourselves from asking the questions, we are going to stop innovation. And guess what? What happens if hydroxychloroquine was the solution? But because it went political, because it went, the route of a bad drug, all of a sudden, a drug from 1920s is a bad drug, a drug that has never caused any problem, that half of Africa is on for malaria, all of a sudden is a big problem. Who does that? Who says that? Same with ivermectin. A drug we gave to babies for scabies is all of a sudden a problem for COVID dying patients. I mean, it was safe to give to babies for scabies, but now it's not safe for people that are dying with oxygen saturations of 50%. So there's a problem there. And that's the shame about the whole research being.
Well, I think, yeah. And I think to your point, like, I think science is asking questions, right? Especially you're a researcher. That's what you do. You ask questions and then you come up with ways to answer them, which is through research and testing.
And that's why we do clinical research. That's why scientists that are in a lab with their PhD, that are doing the experiment, come to doctors like me and my colleagues to do clinical trials at the clinical level, because thousands and thousands of hypotheses come out through the FDA. Maybe 1% of those make it to the next level. So, I would hope that we're not entering into a world where the money guides these drugs to get into the next level, because that's a problem. That's destruction of humanity, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Actually, I have another podcast. I just had people on talking about the dominant biomedical research agenda and how much it's influenced by industry and profit. And it's really discouraging. And I think ultimately it will actually dissuade curious, smart people from pursuing careers, because you want to be able to ask these questions, right? That's the fun of it, and be able to explore. Right.
I mean, listen, the idea that robots can replace a human being and a human touch to heal is not there. Okay. I mean, the fact is, you could put people on medications and you can try, but there needs to be that human touch, right? That human touch that gives you hope. I think a lot of times, my husband's a cardiologist, and both of us have had quite good karma in our practices. Not too many people have died on our shifts. And I think part of it is because we give hope to people. Part of healing is giving hope, right? When you have a child with autism that you're going to try to help them, it's to give them hope, because if you don't give them hope, what is there? And that's our role. It's not to give a formula and say, okay, do A, B, C, D, because A, B, C, D may not work for that person. But what will work for that person is the hope, the changing the mindset that their kid's going to be fine, to see the light, to focus on positive. So
I agree. I think that there's a magic to the human touch that you just can't replace. As much as we try, you're not going to be able to replace that. And I'm kind of happy about that.
I mean, otherwise we're just robots.
Yeah, that's really, well, that's like Brave New World stuff, but that was ultimately a depressing ending, I think. But we might.
It's so funny because that was one of my posts on Facebook, was Brave New World. Is it better to live in a life of delusion than in a life of reality. Well, for those people that have been tormented and victimized and there's no changes, probably for those people, it's best to be in a delusion world. But for the people that are trying to do their part to change the world, to improve the world, to help people, remember, the doctors on the front line, and why did I step in to help them to begin with, were without a mask. They risked their lives to save other lives. And I think we forget that, right? When I sent my husband to the hospital as a cardiologist around COVID patients, he was bare. He didn't even have a mask. I didn't have a mask. My siblings didn't have masks. So we had to fabricate these cloths, and we went to Michael's to figure out how to, find a mask or protection. That wasn't our role. That wasn't our job. We should have had protection. And so the fact that we were left there and we took it upon ourselves to say, you know what, I'm risking my life to help another person. That's what it's all about. That's what humanity is all about. To help those that are less fortunate, that are less able to speak, that have been traumatized, that have been victimized, that have not gone in the same privileged pathway as others. And so, to me, that's my path. That's what I stand for.
That's amazing. And I think it's unfortunate that, if you're facing backlash or censorship, like just for trying to be a scientist, yeah, that's sad. That's sad. And I hope people.
And it hurts because it's sort of like, wait a minute, I went into this, I spent my own funds, nobody sponsored my research, nobody's paying for my stool sampling. That cost $1,500 per sample. Taking care of a patient with COVID cost me, just between Holter monitor, medications, FedEx, and all that, $3,500 per patient. Nobody, came to me and said, okay, do it. I just jumped in it. Now, if it comes out as a product and then we become a pharmaceutical company or whatever, great. But that was not the intent. The intent was, I want to see the research. I want to see the research for myself first, because I'm going to be the patient. And that's why I did all this. I jumped in to create Microbiome, because I said to myself, wouldn't it be a shame if when I'm 90 years old, I have Alzheimer's and I had the treatment and I knew what bugs it was, but I didn't take on, at 50, I was scared to embark on looking at the abyss. I was scared to spend money. I was scared of being criticized, all those things kind of said, I need to do it. And I do it for me first and my family. And then if I help the rest of the world, great. But I think we need to be able to ask questions, and we need to be ethical. We need to be fully transparent. When I put these protocols on clinicaltrials.gov, I could have put a chemical formula of hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, vitamin C, D, and zinc, and made it a beautiful proprietary product. But that wasn't the point. The point was full transparency, so that we can show other doctors around the world how to treat their patients. And that was my biggest gift, in a way, to put on clinicaltrials.gov my ideas of how to fix this. So there was the disaster plan to begin with first. And then the second one was, how do I send the message of these drugs might be the solution? So I posted it on April 2nd on clinicaltrials.gov, knowing that if I show all the doctors and all the scientists, they will treat all their patients. And that went viral without me doing anything about it. So, except I didn't realize that President Trump was going to talk about hydroxychloroquine.
Right. And then it was, what happened after that? Was it just awful?
I couldn't recruit, period. It was done, killed. I mean, we had the one side of the right side that was, believing in it. But the problem is we're divided. And remember, it's like the microbiome. If you have a divided microbes, right, and they stand in without a balance, not in unity, not in balance, you're going to have viruses penetrate. Same thing here. You have a world that's divided, where we're here. We need to be here and we need to be together. But instead, we're not seeing this. And that's what's a shame. This virus, I think to me, this virus was symbolic of unity, of bringing the planet together. And it failed to do that. Instead, we're more divided than ever. And that's a shame.
It's really interesting too, just kind of like a person's political leanings. You hear it's like they have a different interpretation of the pandemic versus somebody else, and that's really it's like at least two sets of facts out there, and that is crazy. It's crazy to think about that.
Yeah, it's two sets of facts, and I stayed middle ground on my views in politics because I don't really think it's black and white again. Some politicians on the right side are great. Some politicians on the left side are great. I stay middle ground. So I get both sides on my social media. But I look at my friends that are completely to the right or completely to the left, and their vision is only on the right or only on the left. And I think you saw that from that documentary on social media. That's what they prey on, right? They prey on your hate. They prey on your interest, and then they guide you. So I started changing the narrative in my social media to be all about gardening. And now I'm seeing beautiful plants, and they're trying to sell me, different trellises and different pots of plants. I'm like, perfect. That's exactly what I want.
So that's hilarious. I'm going to try that on my end. I try to maintain middle ground too. It's hard though. And you lose friends no matter what you do. They're like, yeah.
You have to resist that thing in you that could potentially create hate. You have to resist it, because when you put it out there and you agree with someone like, oh, I hate this person, then all of a sudden it brings you to that path. So you really have middle ground, loving everyone, being happy about everything.
Yeah. And it's like one view can get you on like the crap list, so to speak. It's like you're reduced to one thing. It's like that old joke, like you go out and you sleep with one goat or something. Like it reminds me so much of that joke, because I'm like, oh, this person tweeted something at midnight and look, they're done. Their career's over. It's like, it's a weird world.
And it's never over. Good publicity, bad publicity, no publicity. So I think that's what they teach you in marketing 101. So it's never over. You just have to kind of develop that tough skin to say, I don't care. I mean, and probably why am I in this world? I've had so many hits in my life as a woman GI, solo practitioner, so, embarking on a world of microbes, that to me, it became, okay, well, what else are they going to say about me? Fine, whatever. I don't care. I mean, and then when you start taking on that attitude, which is, I'm here for a job, figuring out the microbiome, and it's not going to save me from my death, right? I'm eventually going to die. So, all of us. So I'm here for one job and one job only, which is cracking the code of the microbiome. And that's it. And hopefully in cracking the code, it'll unify the world to want to come to my path, to say, wait a minute, I want to understand it also, because we are so obsessed with the materialistic things and material that we forget. And yes, the material is great because it allows you to get to the next step, but we shouldn't forget that with that material, we have to do good and we have to change the world for better. I would love, my path is when I rest on my last day on the planet, I will say, you know what, I did good. I did my job. I feel good about it. And that's all somebody can ask for, because otherwise, if there is an afterlife and there is a remorse, I'd be in remorse my whole life. I don't want to do that.
We don't have a lot of time, but I wanted to ask you about your book, which I plan on reading. I don't know if I can even say that, let's talk. Maybe they'll bleep it out. I have no idea, what if that's allowed. I mean, I say it all the time, but
we all say it, and it's so funny because there's a book which is, and I joke and I say, wait, the book, The Art of Not Giving a Blank.
Yeah. Popular book. Yeah.
Bestseller. And let's talk sh.t. We can't even advertise on Facebook because it's a bad word. And how many people say it?
And it's healthy to say, it's healthy to curse there were some studies on that.
100%. And I named it that for two reasons. I named it that because I wanted to make people smile, because I think, that makes people smile automatically. I knew I would be getting a lot of jokes about it, and it's okay because I never really take myself too seriously. So it was fine. I was ready for that. And then the other thing is I wanted to be transparent. I didn't want to sugarcoat it. I didn't want to call it the refloralization book. I didn't want to call it the microbiome book. I wanted to call it what it is and what we are finding and what we are doing as doctors and playing with to get to cures. It's not easy. It's definitely not a pleasurable procedure we do. I mean, I have a lot of Noxzema on my mask when I do it. So, we do it because we believe in it, right? So that's it. And you know what? Laughter is the best medicine, in my opinion. And we have to be, hopeful and laugh, because without that, then we're just, what's the point?
I agree. I do a lot of laughter yoga. And the founder once said, he's like, when you can't laugh, laugh. And I'm like, that's it. That's it. Dr. Hazan, I want to thank you so much. This was enjoyable. I learned a lot, and I look forward to sharing it with our viewers.
There's a paper coming out soon on the microbiome and COVID-19, because we are publishing that data.
Yeah. Okay.
It's gonna be a game changer.
Well, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day out there in California.